The fluorescent lights buzzed with an irritating monotony that seemed to echo Officer James' racing thoughts. He stood outside the Springfield Convention Center, his hand resting protectively on Max's broad head, gathering the courage to walk through those glass doors. The morning sun hadn't yet burned away the chill of early autumn, and found himself wishing the day would remain cold and frozen, suspended in this moment before everything changed forever. Max was a 7-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of burnished copper and mahogany. His eyes, once sharp and alert, now carried a cloudiness that spoke of confusion and pain. A thin scar ran along his right hind leg, a permanent reminder of the night that changed both their lives. That night, 3 months, 17 days and counting, had become the dividing line between before and after in his mind. Had been partnered with Max since the dog was 2 years old. They'd started together at the K9 Academy, both nervous in their own ways, both learning to trust each other in an environment where trust could mean life or death. Was a quiet man, not given to displays of emotion or sentiment. Other officers had ribbed him over the years about how seriously he took his partnership with Max, how he talked to the dog like a person, how he spent his lunch breaks just sitting with the animal instead of joining the guys at the station diner. But didn't care. Max wasn't just a police dog to him. Max was his brother, his constant, his reason for coming to work with purpose every single morning. In 7 years, the two of them had completed 847 successful drug detection operations. They'd searched over 3,000 locations, identifying narcotics that would have flooded the streets of Springfield and the surrounding counties. They'd worked together through scorching summers and brutal winters, through his divorce, through the death of his father, through victories and devastating failures. Max had apprehended 156 suspects, his tracking ability legendary among law enforcement professionals across 3 states. Police departments in neighboring regions had specifically requested to work with the Max and team. They were efficient, reliable, and they'd never made a major mistake. But mistakes happened to everyone eventually. The incident was classified, details buried in police reports, but couldn't stop replaying it in his mind 1,000 times a day. They'd been pursuing a suspect fleeing a major drug operation bust. The man was desperate, dangerous, armed. He'd run into an abandoned warehouse and had released Max to track him. The suspect had a gun. The suspect had panicked. The shot was meant to slow the dog down to create an escape window. Instead, the bullet had grazed Max's hind leg, damaging tendons and nerves in a way that meant the dog would never work at capacity again. The veterinarian had been direct about it. "He'll recover," doctor had said, her professional demeanor masking what sensed was genuine compassion. Physically, he should regain full mobility eventually, but the nerve damage means he'll always have some pain, some instability. More importantly, he's traumatized. You're looking at PTSD in dogs. He may never be suitable for active duty again. Retired. The word had hit like a punch to the solar plexus. Max wasn't just his work partner. He was the structure around which had organized his entire life. What was he supposed to do with a retired police dog? What was Max supposed to do, having known only the discipline and purpose of law enforcement? And then there was the question that nobody wanted to address directly, but which hung in the air like smoke. What happened to police dogs who couldn't work anymore? That question had motivated to advocate fiercely for Max's placement through proper channels. He'd contacted rescue organizations, spoken to veterinary specialists, even reached out to his captain about adoption programs. But most places couldn't take a potentially unstable, trauma-affected police dog. Insurance liability issues, safety concerns, the costs of ongoing veterinary care. Had heard every explanation, every polite rejection. Finally, the department had arranged this auction. K9 retirement auctions were designed to place retired dogs with suitable families or handlers. Had attended others, and he'd seen how quickly most dogs sold, usually to experienced handlers, former officers, or people specifically seeking police animals. But Max was different. Max came with medical expenses, behavioral challenges, and uncertainty. Captain had been sympathetic but firm. The department has responsibilities to the other units. We can't absorb the costs indefinitely. The auction is the next logical step. So here they were. Pushed through the glass doors and Max followed, his limp more pronounced when he was anxious. The convention center's entrance hall was vast and echoing, their footsteps clicking against polished concrete. Could see the auction area beyond, visible through a set of large arched doorways. The stage was already being set up. Handlers were walking back and forth with clipboards. Other dogs were being brought in for the day's auction. Some retired, some seized from criminal investigations, some surrendered by owners who could no longer care for them. Led Max to a quieter corner near the registration table, away from the chaos. He sat down on a metal folding chair, and Max immediately pressed himself against leg, seeking comfort and closeness. Ran his fingers through the dog's thick coat, feeling the familiar warmth beneath, remembering 1,000 similar moments of connection. "This is going to be okay," whispered, not entirely sure he believed it but needing to say it anyway. "You're going to find a good home. Someone's going to see what I see, your heart, your loyalty, your worth. Someone's going to understand that you're more than just your service record." Max rested his head on his knee, and for a moment it was just the two of them. No auction, no uncertainty about the future, no trauma or injury or loss of purpose. Just a man and his dog facing the unknown together one final time. A staff member appeared with a clipboard, checking in participants and explaining auction procedures. Went through the motions mechanically, registering Max, receiving his lot number, accepting the documentation. Everything felt dreamlike and horrible, as though was watching someone else go through these steps while his own consciousness hovered somewhere above, observing with detached horror. Soon they would call Max's lot number. Soon would have to walk his partner up onto that stage for strangers to evaluate and judge. Soon the gavel would come down, finalizing the end of an era, the beginning of an unknown chapter. Squeezed Max's ears gently, his voice breaking despite his efforts to remain composed. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "you need to know something. You were the best partner I ever had. You were the best version of me. Thank you for that." And then together, they walked toward the auction stage. The auction hall was filling up rapidly. Estimated there were easily 200 people present, a mixture of professional handlers, experienced dog owners, law enforcement officers, rescue organization representatives, and curious civilians. The air smelled of strong coffee, wet dog, and something couldn't quite identify but which reminded him of disappointment. The low rumble of conversation echoed off the high ceilings, punctuated occasionally by the sharp bark of an anxious dog from the holding areas backstage. Dale, the auctioneer, was a weathered man in his 60s with a tobacco-stained voice and the practiced charm of someone who'd been selling things to people for 40 years. He'd run police dog auctions for the past 15 years, and he understood the business well. He knew what sold quickly and what would struggle. He had a gift for reading a room, knowing exactly when to press for higher bids and when to accept what was being offered. As waited in the wings with Max, watching the auction's opening lots go through their paces, he could see Dale studying him with an expression that looked uncomfortably like pity. The first few dogs sold without much drama. A 3-year-old German Shepherd retired due to arthritis went for $12,000 to a woman who'd raised police dogs her entire life. 2 younger dogs, seized from a criminal investigation, sparked competitive bidding that drove prices upward. The auction house seemed energetic, optimistic, like a gathering of people who believed in second chances for animals. Then it was time. "Lot number 47, Dale announced, his voice carrying across the hall with practiced projection. "We have Max, a 7-year-old German Shepherd police dog, recently retired from active duty. Let me tell you about this animal, folks." felt his stomach clench as Dale began reciting Max's credentials. The auctioneer's voice droned with professional enthusiasm, hitting the high points. 847 successful drug detection operations, 156 apprehensions, commendations from the Springfield Police Department, recognition from the Drug Enforcement Administration, and a spotless service record spanning 7 years. It sounded impressive when Dale said it. It should have sounded impressive. Max's accomplishments were genuinely remarkable, a career that many police dogs never achieved, a track record that most handlers would be honored to claim, but could hear the way Dale's tone shifted subtly as the auctioneer reached the crucial information. Now, Dale continued, Max is recently retired due to a service-related injury. He sustained a leg injury during an active pursuit and has been cleared for retirement by the department's veterinary team. He will require some ongoing physical therapy, and potential buyers should be aware that he may experience some behavioral adjustment as he transitions from active duty to civilian life. Otherwise, this is a solid, reliable animal with proven capabilities. It was then that the invisible wall seemed to descend. Watched as the assembled crowd shifted, people exchanged glances. The woman who'd purchased the arthritic shepherd suddenly seemed very interested in her program. The competitive bidders from the earlier lots sat back in their chairs, making no movement toward their paddles. A few potential buyers stood to examine Max more closely. This was standard procedure, but their body language was entirely different from the enthusiasm they'd shown for the previous dogs. Max was led onto the stage by one of the auction handlers, a young man named who tried to make the dog look as impressive as possible, but Max's limp was impossible to hide. With each step across the platform, his right hind leg betrayed him, hesitating slightly, bearing less weight than the left. The crowd noticed. Of course they noticed. "Who will start the bidding at $5,000? Dale asked, his voice taking on a slightly strained quality that recognized as the sound of an auctioneer working harder than necessary. The room remained silent. Not a single paddle rose, not a single nod from a phone bidder. Nothing. Dale tried again, his tone more insistent. 5,000. That's a bargain for a dog with this service record. Who will give me 5,000 to start? Still nothing. His hands curled into fists. He watched as a man in a gray suit stood up and approached the stage to examine Max in detail. The man was professional, methodical. He checked the dog's teeth, ran his hands along the injured leg, checked Max's eyes and ears. This was exactly what wanted people to do, to understand that Max was fundamentally sound despite his injury. But the man's expression grew increasingly skeptical as his inspection continued. When he finished, he shook his head and returned to his seat without saying a word. A woman in the middle section did the same thing moments later, giving Max an even briefer examination before walking away with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Let's try 4,000, Dale said, and could hear the desperation creeping into his voice now. $4,000 for a dog who's already earned his keep 1,000 times over. The silence that followed was not just an absence of sound. It was an active, oppressive thing, a presence in itself. It seemed to fill the entire auction hall, pressing down on everyone in the room, though suspected he was the only one who truly felt its weight. More people stood to examine Max and studied their faces carefully, searching for even a flicker of genuine interest. What he saw instead was curiosity divorced from conviction. They were looking at Max the way people might examine a piece of furniture at an estate sale, not terrible, but not quite right for their needs, not quite worth the investment. His chest tightened painfully as he realized what was happening. This wasn't about Max's abilities or his record or his worth. This was about the invisible calculation that everyone was making. Injured dog plus behavioral uncertainty plus ongoing medical costs equaled an investment they weren't willing to make. Max wasn't a working prospect anymore. He was a liability. He was a problem. 3,000. Dale's voice had taken on a hollow quality. Surely someone here recognizes the value of a dog with this experience. Looked around the room at the gathered crowd. He saw other officers from his department, men and women he worked with every day, carefully not making eye contact with him. He saw professional handlers who dealt in prime working animals, now totally disinterested. He saw rescue organization representatives making notes on their clipboards, probably writing off Max as unsuitable for their programs. The silence stretched on. Seconds felt like hours. Max stood on the stage, unaware of the significance of the moment, aware only that he was being examined and judged by strangers, and that his handler was somewhere in the crowd, no longer beside him. The dog's tail hung low. His ears were slightly back. He'd spent his entire life learning to read situations, to sense threat and opportunity, and right now his instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. 2,000, Dale's voice cracked slightly. Anyone, $2,000. Felt something break inside his chest. He watched as people began returning to their phones, their conversations, their programs, effectively tuning out of the auction, already deciding to wait for the next lot. This beautiful dog, this loyal partner, this remarkable animal was being silently rejected in real time. Going once, Dale said quietly, and the words sounded like a funeral dirge. And then from the back of the room, something unexpected happened. Emma Richardson sat in the back corner of the auction hall, her small frame nearly swallowed by the oversized metal folding chair. She was 10 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair that her mother had carefully braided that morning, and intelligent dark eyes that observed everything with intense, silent scrutiny. She wore her favorite pink sweater, the soft, forgiving kind that made her feel slightly less exposed to the world, and her fingers had found the loose hem near the bottom, twisting it into an anxious knot as they always did when she was stressed. Her parents sat on either side of her like bookends, a protective barrier between their daughter and the confusing social chaos of the auction hall. Michael Richardson, Emma's father, was a tall man with graying temples and the patient expression of someone who'd learned to adapt his expectations to reality. Sarah Richardson, Emma's mother, was more visibly anxious. Her jaw was set, her shoulders tense, and she kept checking her phone as though calculating an escape route if this therapeutic experiment went badly. Emma had been 9 years old when she stopped talking. Not all at once, and not for any single, identifiable reason. Doctor, the child psychologist who'd been working with Emma for the past year, called it selective mutism, a condition where anxiety essentially locked the child's voice inside, making speech feel impossible in certain social situations despite the absence of any physical problem with the vocal cords or mechanism. Emma could speak at home, though even that had become increasingly difficult. She could speak to her parents and occasionally to her grandmother, but anywhere else, school, social situations, public spaces, her voice simply vanished, trapped behind a wall of panic that no amount of willpower could penetrate. The worst part, Emma had tried to explain to Doctor through written notes and frustrated gestures, was that people misunderstood the silence. Teachers thought she was being defiant. Other kids assumed she was rude or stuck up. Adults interpreted her quiet as coldness or hostility or lack of intelligence. Nobody seemed to understand that Emma's silence wasn't a choice, it was a prison. Her thoughts were perfectly normal. Her desire to communicate was genuine. But the moment she needed to open her mouth and produce words in front of anyone besides her immediate family, her entire nervous system would essentially shut down, flooding her body with panic that made speech impossible. It had started, Sarah suspected, after the incident with Mrs. Class' presentation in 3rd grade. Emma had been assigned to give a presentation on butterflies, a topic she loved deeply. She prepared meticulously, creating beautiful visual aids, practicing her speech in front of her parents a dozen times. But when she stood up in front of the class, something in her brain had essentially malfunctioned. Her heart had begun racing. Her hands had shaken so severely she could barely hold her note cards. Her mouth had gone completely dry, and no sound had come out, just silence, while 23 pairs of eyes stared at her, and Mrs. shifted uncomfortably, and Emma wished desperately that the floor would open and swallow her whole. After that, the silence had gradually expanded. First it was just presentations. Then it was speaking to teachers. Then it was any interaction with peers. By the time she was 10, Emma had essentially become invisible at school, a ghost moving through hallways and classrooms, present in body but absent in every way that mattered socially. Her parents had tried everything. Medication consultations that Emma's pediatrician ultimately didn't recommend for a child so young. Therapy sessions where Emma sat across from well-meaning professionals, unable to answer even the simplest questions. Social skills groups that just made her anxiety worse. Sarah had even attempted to homeschool her for a semester, but that had created different problems: isolation, missed peer interaction, a sense that Emma was being further separated from normal childhood. Doctor had been the first professional to really explain what was happening in a way that made sense. It's not that Emma can't speak, the psychologist had explained during a parent session. Her anxiety is so severe that it essentially overrides her ability to produce speech in social situations. The solution isn't punishment or forcing her to talk. The solution is gradually building her confidence and finding ways to help her manage the anxiety. And sometimes, Doctor had added carefully, breakthrough moments happen unexpectedly, in situations where the emotional reward is significant enough to override the anxiety response. That comment had stuck with Sarah. Breakthrough moments. They sounded theoretical, unlikely, the kind of thing that happened to other people's children, not to Emma. But Sarah had also noticed something about her daughter over the years. Emma connected with animals in a way she didn't connect with people. The family's cat, Whiskers, would curl up in Emma's lap and she'd relax visibly, some of the tension draining from her shoulders. During a visit to her grandfather's farm, Emma had spent hours brushing the horses, moving around them with a confidence and ease she never displayed around humans. Animals didn't judge. Animals didn't create social pressure. Animals accepted silence as communication. When Doctor had casually mentioned that animal-assisted therapy could sometimes help children with selective mutism, Sarah had seized on the idea. The Springfield Animal Shelter had a volunteer program, but Emma's anxiety had made even that initial interaction too overwhelming. Then Sarah had heard about the K-9 unit retirement auction happening at the convention center, an event where retired police dogs would be placed with new families. She'd thought, what if they just went? What if they exposed Emma to a situation involving dogs without any pressure to interact or participate? What if they just let Emma observe, and maybe something would shift? Michael had been skeptical. She's not going to suddenly start talking because of an auction, he'd pointed out reasonably. Probably not, Sarah had agreed. But it won't hurt to try, and maybe seeing animals will help her feel less anxious in general. So they'd come. Emma had been quiet during the drive, quieter than usual, which was saying something. She'd stared out the window, twisting her sweater hem, occasionally glancing at her mother with an expression that mingled anxiety and curiosity. Sarah had squeezed her hand reassuringly. Michael had cranked up the radio to fill the silence, as he always did. Now, sitting in the back corner of the auction hall, Emma observed the scene with her characteristic intense focus. She watched the handlers bring dogs onto the stage. She noted the energy of the crowd, the way certain dogs generated excitement and others generated only polite interest. She saw the woman purchasing the older shepherd, watched her face light up with joy. She saw the handlers and auctioneers moving with practiced efficiency, saw the professionals taking notes and evaluating animals like items on a checklist. And then she saw Max. Even from the back of the room, even watching from a distance as the dog was led onto the stage, Emma sensed something different about this animal. She couldn't have articulated why, she had no words available for complex observation. but she recognized something in Max that resonated with her own internal experience. He moved awkwardly, his right leg hesitating with each step. He held his shoulders slightly tense, as though bracing against invisible threats. His eyes had a quality that Emma understood intimately, a kind of watchful wariness mixed with resignation, as though he'd learned not to expect good outcomes. He was beautiful and broken and afraid, and as Emma watched the crowd's reaction, or rather, the conspicuous lack of reaction, her small hands clenched. She recognized rejection. She knew what it felt like to be present but overlooked, to have value that nobody seemed to recognize, to sense that everyone around you had already decided you weren't worth their investment. Emma's grip on her sweater hem tightened. She watched as Dale asked for opening bids. She watched the silence. She felt her own anxiety rising in sympathy with this injured dog's predicament. And somewhere in that moment, something shifted inside her, a recognition of kinship with another creature who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. Emma's heart had begun racing the moment Max appeared on stage, but not in the pleasant, excited way her heart sometimes raced when she anticipated something good. This was different. This was her body's panic response, the familiar sensation of anxiety flooding her system, her chest tightening, her breath becoming shallow, her palms growing clammy. These were the physical symptoms that accompanied her whenever she was in social situations, the bodily betrayal that made speaking feel impossible. She recognized them. She'd learned to live with them, the way one lives with chronic pain, acknowledging the sensation while trying not to let it dictate her entire existence. But this was different too, and Emma couldn't quite explain why. The dog on stage was being rejected. Emma could see it clearly, could read the body language of the crowd the way she'd become expert at reading nonverbal communication. When you couldn't speak, you learned to observe everything else intensely. You learned to read microexpressions, subtle shifts in posture, the meaning conveyed by what wasn't being said. And what the crowd was communicating about this dog was absolutely clear. He was not wanted. He was not valuable. He was a problem that nobody was interested in solving. Sarah noticed her daughter's distress and reached over to squeeze her hand gently. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, misinterpreting Emma's anxiety as being overwhelmed by the loud environment. "We can leave if this is too much." Emma didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't acknowledge the comment either. She continued watching Max with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. The dog seemed confused by the silence, the lack of the enthusiasm that clearly should have greeted such an accomplished animal. He looked toward the handler, then toward the crowd, his dark eyes reflecting uncertainty and something that looked dangerously like despair. That's when it happened. Max made eye contact with Emma across the distance of the auction hall. It was probably just chance, the dog's eyes sweeping across the crowd, landing momentarily on the figure in the back corner. But to Emma, it felt like recognition. It felt like this broken dog across the room was seeing her, truly seeing her in a way that most humans never did. And she was seeing him. In that exchange of glances, Emma understood something profound that she had no words to articulate. Max was silenced too, in his own way. His trauma had locked him away from his former purpose, from his identity as a working police dog. His injury had made him invisible to people who valued only utility and capability, and the world had decided he was no longer worth anything because he couldn't perform at his previous level. It was exactly what Emma felt about herself. Her anxiety spiked further, a wave of panic that made her want to disappear into her seat, to become even smaller and more invisible than she already was. This moment, this recognition, felt too big, too overwhelming, too significant. Her entire nervous system was screaming at her to stay silent, to stay hidden, to not risk anything. But something else was screaming louder. Emma became aware of her own breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. She could feel her father's protective presence beside her, her mother's concern radiating like heat. She could feel the entire auction hall's collective disinterest in this dog, the way people were already looking away, already moving mentally to the next lot. And she could feel Max's resignation, the way the dog's shoulders seemed to slump slightly as the silence stretched on. Emma's hands trembled. Her mouth went dry, the familiar precursor to her anxiety response. She wanted to speak. She desperately wanted to do something to help, to communicate that this dog mattered, that his value wasn't determined by his physical capability or his service record or his market value. But she couldn't speak. So she did something she'd never done before in public. She didn't overthink it. She didn't allow her anxiety to build a case for inaction. She simply, deliberately, with her entire body shaking with the effort of overriding her panic response, raised her small hand. The auction hall seemed to freeze. It wasn't a dramatic motion. It wasn't a paddle being raised with confidence or a shout of bid. The gesture was small, hesitant, the hand of a child trembling slightly as it rose. But in the context of the complete silence that had surrounded Max's lot, in the context of an auction where no one had shown the slightest interest, that small raised hand was like a lightning bolt cutting through darkness. "We have a bid." Dale's voice suddenly sharpened with surprise and renewed energy. "We have a bid from the young lady in the back." Sarah's head snapped toward her daughter so quickly that Emma heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. Michael reached out instinctively, his hand hovering near Emma's raised arm as though unsure whether to support it or pull it back down. But Emma's hand remained raised. She kept her eyes fixed on Max, and the dog seemed to register this gesture, this small act of defiance against the silence that had surrounded him. His ears perked up slightly. His tail, which had drooped so low it was nearly between his legs, lifted just a fraction. It was a tiny response, but Emma saw it. Emma felt it like a confirmation that she'd done the right thing. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered to Michael, her voice trembling slightly. Emma could sense her mother's shock and amazement without looking away from Max. She could feel the weight of people's attention beginning to turn toward the back of the room, toward the quiet girl who just made the first bid on the rejected dog. Officers standing in the wings watching Max's auction felt something shift in his chest. For the first time since bringing Max to this place, he felt a spark of hope. He watched the girl with the raised hand, trying to understand her. She was young, maybe 10 or 11. She looked terrified. Her entire body was shaking, but her hand remained steady, raised, committed. Emma's anxiety was still screaming. Every fiber of her being was urging her to lower her hand, to retreat, to disappear back into silence and safety. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Her breath was coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct toward self-preservation was activated, demanding that she withdraw this gesture, that she retreat to the safety of invisibility. But she didn't. Instead, she kept her hand raised, and in that moment of overriding her own paralyzing anxiety, something extraordinary began to happen. The silence that had always locked her voice away began to crack, just slightly. The panic that had always made speech impossible didn't disappear, but it became secondary to something stronger, a desperate need to help this creature who understood her suffering. Her parents stared at her in amazement. Around the room, people began to pay attention to the auction again. The auctioneer, sensing renewed opportunity, shifted his tone and energy. But Emma wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking only about Max, about the connection that had formed between them in that moment of mutual recognition, about the fact that sometimes two broken things could see each other's value when no one else could. The moment Emma's hand rose, Dale's entire demeanor transformed. The auctioneer's voice shifted from desperate to energized, like someone who'd just been thrown a life preserver. "Thank you, we have $5,000, Dale announced, his tone suddenly brimming with possibility. "Do I hear 6,000? Almost immediately, a man in a gray suit 3 rose forward, raised his paddle. Sarah felt Michael's hand grip hers tightly. She could sense her husband's internal conflict, the desire to support their daughter's unprecedented public action warring with concern about what they might be bidding on. A police dog, an injured police dog, with ongoing medical needs and behavioral issues. What had they just initiated? 6,000, Dale called out. Do I hear 7? Emma's anxiety spiked dramatically at the sound of competition. Her hand, which had been trembling before, now trembled even more violently. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to lower it, to retreat, to let someone else handle this. The panic that had been manageable a moment ago intensified into something almost unbearable. Her vision seemed to narrow and widen simultaneously. Her chest felt compressed, as though an invisible weight was pressing down on her ribs. This was the moment when Emma always gave up. This was the point in any social situation where her anxiety became so overwhelming that speech became physically impossible, where action became impossible, where all she could do was withdraw and disappear into silence. But Max was still looking at her. She could see him across the room, his gaze fixed on the spot where her small hand remained raised. And she understood, with a clarity that transcended her anxiety, that if she lowered her hand now, Max would be gone. Not just from her life, they'd probably never see him again, but symbolically he'd be gone. He'd be returned to invisibility, to being undervalued, to being a problem no one wanted to solve. She couldn't do that to him. She couldn't abandon him the way the world had abandoned her. So despite the overwhelming panic, despite her body's desperate plea for her to stop, to hide, to retreat into safety, Emma kept her hand raised. "We have another bid." Dale's excitement was almost palpable now. 7,000 from the young lady in the back. Do I hear 8? A woman in the middle section of the auction hall stood up suddenly, her paddle raised with decisive confidence. Emma had noticed her earlier, a woman in her 40s with short hair and an expression of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. The woman had bid on several earlier lots and had purchased one of the younger dogs. She seemed like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone with authority and experience. 8,000, Dale called out, and Emma's heart sank. This woman looked like she could outbid her forever. She looked like someone who had unlimited resources and complete confidence in her ability to acquire whatever she desired. The gray-suited man lowered his paddle and shook his head slightly, as though acknowledging that he'd reached his limit. But Emma's hand had already begun to rise again. Sarah gripped Michael's arm so tightly that he winced. "She's doing it," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She's actually doing it. She's fighting for this." Michael was staring at their daughter with an expression of wonder and concern. "We can't let her bid beyond what we can afford," he said quietly. "We don't know anything about caring for an injured police dog. We can't possibly." "She's speaking," Sarah interrupted, not taking her eyes off Emma. "Not with words, but she's communicating. She's fighting. When has she ever fought for anything before?" The woman with the hair seemed to notice Emma's persistence. She studied the small girl in the back corner with obvious curiosity, as though trying to understand what would drive a child to compete for an injured dog. Something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition or respect, perhaps. 9,000, Dale announced when Emma's hand rose again. The woman hesitated. She looked at Emma. She looked at Max. She looked down at her paddle, which remained lowered at her side. And then she slowly, deliberately, set it down on the chair beside her. "Looks like we might have a winner," Dale said, his voice taking on a tone of genuine amazement. $9,000 from the young lady in the back. Do I hear 10? The gray-suited man shook his head. The woman remained still, her paddle abandoned. The rest of the crowd watched with rapt attention now. This had stopped being a routine auction and had become something else entirely, a story unfolding in real time, a moment of genuine human drama. Emma's hand was shaking so severely that she could barely keep it raised. Her anxiety had reached a fever pitch. She felt dizzy. She felt like she might be sick. Every survival instinct in her body was activated, screaming at her to stop, to sit down, to fade back into the safe anonymity of silence. Her parents sat frozen beside her, unable to intervene, witnessing something extraordinary happening in their usually silent child. 9,000 going once, Dale said, his voice carrying a note of reverence now. Do I hear 10 from anyone? The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence surrounding Max's initial appearance. This silence held tension, anticipation, collective awareness that something significant was occurring. Going twice, Dale continued quietly. Emma's hand began to lower. She didn't consciously decide to lower it. Her exhausted nervous system was simply giving up, unable to sustain the effort of fighting her own panic and competing with other bidders simultaneously. The anxiety had won. She was going to have to retreat now, to accept defeat. But then she felt her mother's hand grip hers gently. Sarah didn't push her hand back up. She simply held it, providing support, providing presence, communicating without words that she was there, that she understood the magnitude of what her daughter was attempting. Emma's hand steadied slightly. She kept it raised. Going 3 times, Dale said, and Emma could hear something like awe in his voice. Do I hear 10? Nothing. Sold. Dale's gavel came down with a definitive crack. At $9,000 sold to the brave young lady in the back. Congratulations. The auction hall erupted in applause. Emma's hand dropped to her lap, and she began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face in the way she'd cried for 4 years, without sound, her entire body trembling with emotion that had no outlet in words. Her mother pulled her close, and her father wrapped his arms around both of them from the other side. Officer, standing in the wings, felt tears running down his own weathered face. He watched as this small girl, this quiet child who just accomplished something extraordinary, clung to her parents while the reality of what she'd done seemed to wash over her. She'd done it. She'd overcome her silence, her anxiety, her fear. And she'd done it for Max. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. Emma remained pressed against her mother, her small body still trembling, though whether from anxiety, triumph, or overwhelming emotion was impossible to determine. She couldn't look up. She couldn't acknowledge the attention that had suddenly focused on her like a spotlight. Her entire nervous system had essentially flooded with adrenaline and stress hormones, and the only safe response seemed to be to remain as small and hidden as possible, even as she'd just done something profoundly visible and brave. Sarah held her daughter tightly, her own eyes overflowing with tears. She'd waited 4 years for some sign that Emma was still fighting, still present, still capable of breaking through her own invisible barriers. She'd attended countless therapy sessions, tried numerous interventions, supported her daughter through the crushing weight of selective mutism. And now, in the span of a few minutes, that weight seemed to have shifted, just slightly. Not disappeared. Emma was still crying silently, still trapped by her anxiety, but shifted enough to suggest that breakthrough was possible. Michael stood and began walking toward the stage to complete the paperwork, his movements somewhat dazed, as though he was moving through a dream. The reality of what they'd just done was beginning to penetrate his shock. They'd bid $9,000 on an injured police dog. They'd never owned a police dog before. They had no experience with trauma-affected animals. What had they been thinking? But as he watched the handler leading Max down from the stage, the dog moving with that characteristic limp, his dark eyes now focused on the small girl in the back corner, Michael understood. They hadn't been thinking. His daughter had stopped thinking and started feeling, had her paralyzing anxiety with something stronger than fear. How could he possibly undo that? How could he possibly explain to Emma that they'd made a mistake? He couldn't. So instead, he approached the registration desk where an official was already preparing paperwork for the sale. Dale, the auctioneer, was beaming with genuine satisfaction. He'd been running K9 auctions for 15 years, and he'd rarely witnessed anything quite like what had just happened. Your daughter, he said to Michael, shaking his hand firmly, just did something remarkable. I've seen a lot of people make bids over the years. I've never seen determination like that. I know, Michael said quietly, glancing back at Emma, who remained curled against her mother. I'm not entirely sure what we've gotten ourselves into, but I know. Officer appeared at Michael's side, his weathered face streaked with tears that he made no attempt to hide. I'm Officer James, he said, extending his hand. I was Max's handler for the past 5 years. I need to tell you something about this dog. Michael shook the offered hand, bracing himself for warnings about behavioral issues, medical complications, aggression stemming from trauma. Max, continued, his voice thick with emotion, is the best dog I've ever known. He's loyal. He's intelligent. He's been through trauma and he'll need patience and compassion while he heals. But he has a good heart. And something tells me, glanced toward Emma, that your daughter understands that she sees it in a way that most people don't. Michael felt something shift in his chest, a letting go of resistance, an acceptance of the extraordinary thing that was happening. The paperwork took nearly an hour to complete. Michael and Sarah had to sign numerous documents regarding Max's medical history, his behavioral assessment, veterinary care instructions, and various liability waivers. A representative from the K-9 unit explained Max's vaccination records, his dietary needs, his physical therapy requirements. They discussed pain management, potential behavioral triggers, the importance of patience during his adjustment period. Throughout all of this, Emma remained in the back corner with her mother, occasionally peeking toward where Max was being prepared for transfer. The dog seemed to understand something significant was happening. He kept his dark eyes focused on Emma's direction, as though she was his anchor, his reason to maintain hope. Finally, everything was processed. The papers were signed. Max officially belonged to the Richardson family. Officer led Max over to where Emma and her family were preparing to leave. Sarah stood, keeping one protective hand on Emma's shoulder. The girl remained sitting, but her eyes were now fixed on Max with an intensity that bordered on spiritual. Knelt beside the girl, his weathered face at her eye level. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Emma's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. She tried again, her face flushing with the familiar frustration of her selective mutism. But this time, something was different. This time she pushed through the anxiety, pushed through the panic, and whispered, "Emma." The word was barely audible, fragile as spun glass, barely more than a breath. But it was there. It was real. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Michael, who'd been returning from the registration desk, froze mid-step. His eyes widened with understanding. "Emma," he repeated gently, honoring the significance of her speaking. "I want you to know something important. Max has had a very hard time, but I think when he looks at you, he sees someone who understands what hard times feel like. I think you two are going to help each other." Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed like tears of connection rather than anxiety. She slowly reached out her small hand toward Max. The dog approached carefully, his injured leg causing him to move slowly. When he reached Emma, he lowered his head to her level, and she buried her fingers in his thick fur. The two of them, the injured girl and the broken dog, stood connected through that simple touch. "I think," said to Michael and Sarah, his own voice breaking, "your daughter just gave my best friend a second chance at life, and I think he's going to give her something back." Sarah was openly crying now, watching her daughter stroke Max's head, watching as the dog's tail began to wag slowly, tentatively, as though he too was learning to hope again. "What should we do?" Michael asked. "With his care, his recovery, everything." "Love him," said simply. "Be patient with him. Understand that healing isn't linear. Some days will be hard, but if your daughter can break through her own barriers," he glanced at Emma, "then Max can break through his too." As the Richardson family prepared to leave with Max, Emma whispered something else to the dog, Another barely audible word that only Max could hear. Watch them go, this small girl and this injured dog, connected by something deeper than words, heading out into an uncertain future together. He turned to Dale, the auctioneer, and said quietly, "I've been doing this for 5 years. I've never seen anything like that." Dale nodded, wiping his own eyes. "Neither have I, neither have I." Outside the convention center, as the October sun began to set, Emma walked beside Max, her small hand resting on his shoulder. Her parents followed, watching their daughter take one tentative step after another toward something neither they nor Emma had anticipated. A future where her silence might finally be broken. 6 months after the auction, the Richardson household had become a sanctuary unlike anything Emma had ever known. The transformation wasn't just physical, though that was certainly visible. The injured dog who'd arrived that October afternoon had slowly begun to move with greater ease, his limp becoming less pronounced with each passing week. But the deeper transformation was invisible, residing in the spaces between heartbeats, in the quiet moments of connection that happened when two broken beings discovered they could heal each other. Max's physical therapy sessions happened twice weekly in Dr. Lisa's clinic, a facility specializing in canine rehabilitation. Doctor was a remarkable woman in her 50s with an encyclopedic knowledge of sports medicine for animals and a remarkable gift for reading a dog's progress. During the first session in November, she'd warned Michael and Sarah that Max's recovery would be unpredictable. "Nerve damage doesn't follow a linear path," she'd explained. "Some days will be better than others. Emotionally, he may struggle even when physically he's improving." But something about having Emma in his life seemed to accelerate Max's recovery in ways Doctor found genuinely remarkable. During the December session, she'd pulled Michael aside and said, "Whatever your daughter is doing with this dog, it's working. I've rarely seen a trauma response reverse this completely. His muscle tone is improving faster than I anticipated. More importantly, he's relaxing. When dogs relax, they heal." The physical improvements were measurable. By December, Max's back leg was bearing almost full weight during his walks. By January, he was able to climb stairs without hesitation, something that had seemed impossible when they first brought him home. By February, he could run in the backyard for short periods without limping noticeably afterward. Doctor adjusted his pain medication downward twice, cautiously optimistic about his overall trajectory. But the emotional transformation, Emma's transformation, was perhaps even more remarkable. It had started with whispers. The day after the auction, Emma had managed to whisper Max's name to the dog. The word had emerged from somewhere deep inside her, bypassing the usual anxiety that locked her voice away. Sarah had cried when she heard it. It wasn't much, just a single word, but it represented something profound, proof that Emma's voice hadn't been permanently destroyed by her selective mutism. Over the following weeks, Emma's verbal output had gradually increased. She spoke to Max regularly, her voice still quiet, still hesitant but present. She told him about her day. She read to him from her favorite books. She hummed while brushing his coat. Max seemed to understand that these vocalizations were significant, that Emma was doing something courageous every time she made sound, and he responded by settling against her, providing the emotional anchor she needed to keep pushing through her anxiety. By mid-November, Emma had managed to speak a full sentence to her mother while Max was present. "I want to walk Max," she'd said, the words emerging more easily when she was focused on something external, on a need outside herself. Sarah had stood frozen for a moment, then pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. School had been more complicated. Emma's teachers had been kept informed of her progress, and they'd adjusted their approach accordingly. Instead of forcing her to participate in group settings, they'd allowed her to work with the school counselor, a kind woman named Ms. Martinez, in quieter, more controlled environments. Ms. Martinez had been instrumental in helping Emma understand that her voice mattered, that her silence was a symptom of anxiety rather than a personal failing, that her worth wasn't determined by how much she spoke. By December, Emma had managed to raise her hand in class and answer a question, her voice barely audible but audible. The class had erupted in quiet applause, understanding that something significant had occurred. After that, it became easier. Not easy exactly, but easier. The more Emma spoke, the more her brain seemed to understand that speaking didn't result in catastrophe, that her anxiety, while present, could be managed. Max's presence at school events had also helped. In January, Dr. Emma's therapist had arranged for Max to visit Emma's school as part of a special assembly on animal rescue and rehabilitation. Emma had stood in front of her entire fourth-grade class and, with her hand resting on Max's head, had told their story. Her voice had trembled, her hands had shaken, but she had spoken. "This is Max," she'd said, her words coming slowly but steadily. "He was hurt and everyone thought he didn't matter anymore, but he does matter. And I'm hurt too in different ways, and Max helps me, and I help him, and together we're both getting better." The applause had been thunderous. Several teachers and students had cried. Emma had remained standing there, her hand on Max's head, and for the first time in 4 years, she'd felt visible in a way that didn't terrify her. At home, the healing process continued in small, intimate moments. Emma had created a dedicated space in her room for Max, a comfortable bed near her window where the dog could rest while she did her homework. She talked to him while studying, explaining math problems to a dog who had no understanding of fractions but who listened with complete attention, offering validation simply through his presence. Max, in turn, seemed to understand Emma's needs with an almost supernatural intuition. On the days when Emma's anxiety spiked, when she couldn't manage more than whispers, Max would press himself against her leg, grounding her, reminding her that she was safe. On the days when she felt frustrated with her slow progress, when she desperately wanted to speak normally but couldn't quite manage it, Max would rest his head on her lap, and somehow that gesture communicated, "I understand struggle. I understand frustration. I understand that healing takes time." By March, Emma had joined the school art club, a small group where she'd always felt more comfortable participating, since art could be accomplished without constant verbal communication. She'd created a series of paintings about Max's recovery, bold watercolors depicting a dog climbing from darkness into light. Her art teacher had been so moved that she'd requested permission to display the paintings in the school hallway. In April, Emma managed something that had seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. She participated in a video call with Officer. Max had recognized his former handler's voice immediately, his tail wagging with genuine joy. Emma had spoken to for nearly 10 minutes, her voice growing more confident as she described Max's progress, his personality, the way he'd helped her find her voice. Had cried on that call, great, unashamed tears of gratitude and closure. "Thank you," he'd said to Emma, his voice breaking. "Thank you for saving him. Thank you for understanding that he was worth saving." "He saved me too," Emma had whispered back, barely audible but absolutely clear. By late May, as spring transitioned toward summer, Emma and Max had become inseparable symbols of mutual recovery. Emma had gone from complete silence in school to speaking in class regularly, though still more quietly than some of her peers and still struggling on difficult days. Max had gone from a limping, traumatized dog to a happy, playful companion who could run and jump with only occasional stiffness. Neither was completely healed. Emma still experienced anxiety, and Max still had days when his injury bothered him. But they had both moved from survival mode to actually living. Doctor had marveled during Max's final physical therapy session in June. "I've been doing rehabilitation for 20 years, she told Michael and Sarah. "And I have to tell you, this is one of the most remarkable recoveries I've ever seen, not just physically, but emotionally. There's a lightness to him now that wasn't there before." Sarah had smiled, watching Emma play fetch with Max in the backyard. "I think they needed each other," she'd said simply. And Michael, standing beside his wife, watching his daughter laugh. actually laugh out loud, as Max bounded back with a tennis ball, had agreed completely. The Springfield Animal Shelter's annual fundraiser was held on a warm Saturday evening in late June, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The event was held in the shelter's outdoor amphitheater, a circular seating area nestled among mature oak trees that provided dappled shade and a sense of intimate community gathering. Nearly 200 people had assembled: rescue volunteers, animal lovers, staff members, donors, and curious community members who'd heard about the special presentation scheduled for that evening. Sarah Richardson smoothed down Emma's blue sundress one final time, her hands trembling slightly with maternal nervousness. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," she whispered, though Emma's attention was entirely focused on Max, who sat beside her in his special harness, groomed to perfection, his copper-colored coat gleaming in the evening light. Emma didn't respond verbally. Her anxiety was already building in anticipation of what was about to happen, but she reached down and stroked Max's head, drawing comfort and courage from his solid presence. This was a much larger crowd than she'd ever spoken to before. Her stomach was churning. Her hands were clammy. Every symptom of her anxiety disorder was activated and screaming at her to find an excuse to leave, to run, to hide. But Emma had learned something over the past 8 months. Anxiety didn't have to dictate her choices. It could be present without being in control. Michael squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. "Ready." Emma looked up at her father, then at her mother, then down at Max. The dog gazed back at her with complete confidence, as though to say, "I'm ready if you're ready. We can do this together." Emma nodded. They walked toward the small stage at the front of the amphitheater. The crowd's attention shifted immediately, recognizing that this was the event they'd been waiting for. A hush fell over the gathering as a woman named Doctor, the shelter's director, approached the microphone to make introductions. "Good evening, everyone," Doctor's voice carried warmly across the assembled crowd. "Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from someone whose story embodies exactly what our shelter's mission is all about: second chances, rescue, and the profound healing that happens when humans and animals connect. I'd like to introduce Emma Richardson and Max, a dog and girl whose journey together has inspired everyone who's heard it. Emma, Max, please come up." Emma walked slowly toward the stage, Max moving beside her with that characteristic slight limp that was barely noticeable anymore. The crowd erupted in warm applause. Emma could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could sense their attention and anticipation. The old Emma, the Emma of 4 years ago, would have been completely paralyzed by this moment. She would have been unable to produce a single word. She would have retreated into the safety of silence. But Emma wasn't that girl anymore. They reached the microphone, and Doctor adjusted it down slightly to accommodate Emma's height. Sarah and Michael sat in the front row, both holding their breath, both silently offering their daughter every ounce of support and love they possessed. Emma stood at the microphone. She took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. "This is Max," she said, her voice barely audible at first, trembling slightly but present. "And this is me. We were both broken." The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something significant. "Max was hurt during his work as a police dog," Emma continued, her voice growing slightly steadier as she focused on the story rather than her anxiety. "He was hurt, and everyone thought he didn't matter anymore. They thought he was worthless because he couldn't do his job anymore, because he was injured and scared." She paused, stroking Max's head gently. The dog leaned into her touch, offering visible support. "I'm hurt too," Emma said quietly, "but my hurt is invisible. For 4 years I couldn't talk to people. I was so scared that I just stopped. My voice got stuck inside me and I couldn't let it out. People thought I was being rude. People thought I was weird. People thought I didn't have anything to say, but I did. I just couldn't say it." Emma's voice was growing stronger now, more confident, as though speaking the truth was its own form of healing. Last October, my mom brought me to an auction, she continued. They were selling dogs, including Max, and when I saw him on that stage, I saw myself. I saw someone who was hurting, who was invisible, who everyone had decided didn't matter anymore. And I raised my hand. I bid on him. I fought for him. And I did it without speaking a word because I couldn't speak yet, but I spoke with my actions. And Max understood what I was saying. He understood that I was saying, "You matter. You're worth fighting for." The crowd was completely riveted now. Some people had tears streaming down their faces. Several volunteers from the shelter were openly crying. And then something miraculous happened, Emma said. We helped each other. Max helped me find my voice. He made it safe for me to speak because I could practice speaking to him without being scared. I could read to him. I could talk to him about my day. And he just listened. He just accepted me exactly as I was. Emma looked directly into the crowd now, making eye contact with people, something that would have been impossible for her 6 months ago. And I helped Max too, she continued. I gave him a purpose again. I gave him love and patience while he healed. I gave him a reason to believe that his life still mattered, that he was still valuable, even though he couldn't be a police dog anymore. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the amphitheater. I think that's what we all need sometimes, Emma said. We need someone to see us, really see us, and to believe in us when we can't believe in ourselves. We need someone to understand that our value isn't determined by what we can do or how productive we are. We need someone to love us even when we're broken. Emma looked down at Max, and the dog gazed back at her with absolute devotion. The bond between them was visible, tangible, something that transcended language. Max gave me my voice back, Emma said, and I gave him his purpose back, and we're both still healing. Some days are harder than others. Some days I still get scared and can't talk. Some days Max's leg still bothers him, but we're healing together. And we're proving that rescue isn't just about giving animals a second chance. It's about recognizing that everyone, human or animal, deserves to be seen, valued, and loved. The applause that followed was thunderous, rising in waves, people standing to their feet, many openly weeping. Emma stood at the microphone, her hand resting on Max's head, and for the first time in 4 years she felt completely, authentically seen and valued. Officer, who'd been invited to attend the event, stood in the back of the crowd, tears streaming down his weathered face. He watched the girl and dog who'd saved each other, who'd both moved from the margins to the center, from invisibility to visibility, from despair to hope. After the presentation concluded, donations flooded in for the animal shelter. Rescue organizations requested information about establishing similar programs pairing rescued animals with children struggling with anxiety. Emma's story went viral on social media, reaching millions of people and inspiring similar connections between humans and animals in crisis. But what mattered most to Emma wasn't the recognition or the impact. What mattered most was the solid warmth of Max beside her, the knowledge that together, they transformed their broken places into something beautiful, something healing, something that proved that sometimes the most unlikely pairs create the most powerful transformations. As the sun set completely that evening, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and indigo, Emma and Max walked together toward the car, no longer broken, no longer invisible, no longer alone. They'd found each other in the silence, and in finding each other, they'd found themselves. The end.